But it's a special pleasure to be here today because we are at a critical juncture. We have a special moment, a moment that has not been here before, a moment that may well not come again, a moment in which we can make historic change and progress. And so we've heard a lot already today, powerfully, from Jeff and the panel, imploring us of what needs to be done. And what I want to talk to you today about is how we do that. What is it that we can do this year to move us forward on our objective and our goal? My father was a development economist of some note. I was born into a family concerned about the Brandt Commission, the Brundtland Commission, Our Common Future, the South Commission, concerns about vulnerability and vulnerable states. I was born in to the moral imperative of development. And my growing up was a realization that that moral imperative is not enough. That just the moral imperative alone did not change anything. Humanity has its highs and its lows, and one of its lows is its ability to be blind to the poverty and inequality of our world. So we sometimes reach for enlightened self-interest, making people realize that we live in a common world, in one world and one family and one life. You know, one of the founding articles for the World Bank and the IMF was John Maynard Keynes's The Economic Consequences of the Peace, where he argued that it's not in British and French interests to underdevelop Germany. It was his bestseller, in fact, not because it was heeded, but because it proved to be right. So unfortunately, there isn't enough enlightenment either. If we're going to make a change, we really do need to forge a global coalition where people can see directly the benefits and interests to all, where all are contributing and all are benefiting. And I think uniquely that space in which that occurs is in climate change. I think in climate change we are seeing the real development of a global coalition for change. And climate change has all of the issues of justice, inequality, and need for global action. Global warming has been caused by the stock of greenhouse gases put there by the wealthy countries in their industrialization. Indeed, their wealth directly correlates to their contribution of the stock of global greenhouse gases. But we can't sit back and ask them to make all the change, because today, in the modern world, where they have become wealthier, where they've changed their consumption and their production and their tastes, and production has shifted to other parts of the world, now a majority of greenhouse gases are being emitted by the developing world. Not the majority of the stock, but a majority of the emissions. We have a carbon budget of 15% left. And if we want to save the world from 1.5 degrees, which is not a target, not a goal, but a limit, then we need to find ways of reducing our emissions. The dichotomy, and it was talked about earlier in our session, the dichotomy between development and climate, we think is a false dichotomy. I think it is a space that is an opportunity to build a global coalition, and it is a space that's about development. When you look at those who are most vulnerable to loss and damage from climate, who are most vulnerable and most need adaptation, you look at those who suffer in development, look at those who suffered most during COVID, look at those who suffered most during the global financial crisis, you find these are all generally the same people. These are all different windows on the same problem, global problem of poverty and inequality. And you cannot do development without thinking of climate. 40,000 people have died in the Somalian droughts. 100 million people will be pushed into poverty as a result of climatic loss and damage. You can't worry about education of girls when 27,000 schools in Pakistan are underwater because the glaciers are melting. These two things are part of the same. So how do we achieve change for development and for climate change? And even beyond issues of loss and damage and issues of adaptation and resilience, the green transformation is the best development strategy for developing countries. It is the best production strategy, sustainably so, the most efficient, boosts our productivity, and produces sustainable development. So how do we achieve it? I want to present a framework of how we achieve it. We need about $2 trillion per year in developing countries, and that's being conservative. $2 trillion per year. And because these numbers are big, we've had a diversity of responses. Some in the countries have contributed most to global warming, are putting their bets on technology will solve the problem. Insurance will solve the problem. Financial innovation will solve the problem. And others are saying, well, you caused it, you've got to pay for it. None of these solutions would get us to where we need to be. We need to break down what we need to do into three. There are those things for which revenues are attached. Much of the green transformation, some of the investments in nature capital, some elements of adaptation, though not much, have revenue streams attached. Then there are things that don't have a revenue stream attached, but where there are savings, for which we can borrow for to benefit from these future savings. Where there are revenue streams attached, we need to involve the private sector. Where there are savings, we need to shift the multilateral development banks so they are playing a much greater role, where we are doubling and trebling the amount that they lend. We're releasing $1 trillion extra. This is possible. The G20 Working Party highlighted the fact that we need to employ callable capital, SDRs, and if we do so effectively, make callable capital callable, we can create that headroom. And that headroom needs to be focused on those investments and adaptation and resilience for which there are not revenue streams attached, but there are savings to be had. And then there's stuff that there are no revenue streams attached. There are no savings, but we need to do. And much of that is the loss and damage agenda, the loss and damage from climate change. Some of the investments we need to do in nature capital, in reforestation, in defending our biodiversity. Some of these things, no revenue streams, no savings. We need grant money for that. We can limit and focus the grant money on those things that we can't get revenues for, that we can't save for, but there's still that check that needs to be written. It's not a check for everything. It's not the biggest check, but it is a check. And we need, because ODA budgets, overseas development assistance budgets, they're getting no bigger. They're shrinking. I say that governments are not getting elected to fund the foreigners. They're getting elected to deport foreigners. In that world, we need to find a way of focusing the grants onto those things that cannot be funded in any other way, but we need those grants. We need new additional revenue streams to fund those things. We believe the fossil fuel industry needs to make its contribution. $4 trillion of revenues last year. Just 1% will fund loss and damage. The agricultural sector, the shipping sector and transport sector, 1% of these will solve our loss and damage problem without touching our ODA budgets. So we need to double and treble MDB lending using callable capital. We need new additional revenue streams. And let me end and talk a little bit more about how we mobilize the private sector. Because yes, and it was discussed a little bit yesterday, just a moment ago, 70% or more of the funding we need can only come from the private sector. Developing countries don't have the balance sheet for it. Philanthropists can play a critical role, but they don't have the balance sheet for it. We're talking about almost $1 trillion, over $1.5 trillion per year. But that private sector is not coming to developing countries today because the cost of capital is too high. And when we say that, people say, well, we need to reduce risks. Cost of capital is high because it's risky. And the multilateral development banks say, well, the problem is developing countries don't have the right policies. They don't have the right regulation. They don't have the right plans. They don't have the right investable projects. The hidden agenda there is, it's your problem. You need to get your act together. But if you actually look at the cost of capital, the cost of India borrowing versus Germany borrowing, the cost of an Indian project in solar borrowing versus a German project, over 75% of this cost of capital is nothing to do with the regulation, with the individual project plans. It's a macro risk problem. It's a currency risk problem. We live, if you look at the fundamentals of Bokolo on the other the panel is from Botswana, a country with better economic fundamentals than any country in Europe today. Better economic fundamentals than any country in Europe today. Its borrowing costs several hundred percentage points higher. It doesn't have an ECB. It doesn't create an international reserve currency. We need an international body that uses callable capital, uses SDRs, sits in the middle of our multilateral development banks, being able to use their capital and their liquidity, whose purpose is to lower macro risks for investing in green transformation, and lowering that cost of capital and driving $1 trillion plus of investment in developing countries. And that is the framework I wish to leave you with. They are things with a revenue stream attached, for which we need to mobilize the private sector, but they will not come on their own. And it's not just about getting your plans together. It's about lowering macro risk. There's a role to be played for within the network of the multilateral development banks, a new agency, a green, just transition, financing trust, a green, just transition with a financing element to lower the cost of capital, the macro risks. We need to double and treble the MDB lending and focus that on creating resilience and adaptation, things the private sector is not going to do. And we need to create new additional revenue streams for the loss and damage that you cannot borrow for and you cannot insure for. Insurance works when you've got uncertainty but a steady risk. Climate change is an uninsurable event, a rising risk with rising correlations. We need grant money for that. And let me end with a few things where you do not need money at all for. Because really, I think the moment here is to put feet to the fire. It is a moment to say, do you really care? Because previously you have said it's about money, and here's a solution that's not about money. Here's a solution you can fund today. We need to change the global financial system. We need to have natural disaster clauses in every debt instruments. These are clauses which are not a bet on climate change or natural disaster, reshuffle payments across the payment stream. So when you have a natural disaster, you have a 2-year pause. And then those payments are added back on later. It's no cost to the creditor, but the borrower gets a different phasing of payments. If everybody had these during the COVID crisis, it would have released $1 trillion of liquidity in developing countries. No instrument comes close, costs nobody anything. We need countries to start putting natural disaster clauses. We need the IMF to start playing the role of a liquidity player of last resort for countries. We've just seen last week what the Federal Reserve does when banks are under pressure in America. Billions of dollars of short-term liquidity is provided. Universally to the market. No conditionality. We give it to everybody so that there's no opprobrium, there's no stigma. How do we do it internationally? Come to us, case by case, conditional. We need market-wide access to liquidity. Again, something that in the long run costs us nothing. So that is the agenda, ladies and gentlemen. It's not just about imploring that we need to do something. Here's a plan with ambition, a plan that's achievable, a plan that we can champion today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Avi. I've had the privilege of seeing you address many different audiences in many different contexts, and it never fails to re-energize me every time I hear how simple and clear your recommendations are, but also how, if you put them all together, how systemic they are in nature. So that's going to be the focus of our panel discussion today, and I'd now like to turn it over to some of our distinguished panel members to hear their reflections. I think the good thing is we have a pretty good representation of cross-sectors up on the stage here. We have government, we have the private sector, we have MDBs, we have the UN, we have think tanks, and philanthropy. So I think it'll be interesting to see if there is an emerging consensus or commonalities among the recommendations that each of these sector representatives might put forward to the Indian G20 presidency. And my hypothesis is that there will be, in which case that probably means that they're worth paying attention to. So without further ado, actually let me just touch base on a few logistics. In the interest of time, let's keep it to one round of questions for the panelists. But within that, it would be great if each of you can specifically address which recommendations you would put forward to the Indian G20 presidency as the top priorities for them to champion on the financing reform agenda. And if you need to take a bit more time to elaborate within your one round of comments, that's fine. And then we can leave the remaining time to have some more questions from the audience. So let me turn it over to you first, Amar. You've written and spoken extensively on the so-called big push that is needed to invest in global economic recovery and sustainable growth. We're talking in the order of, your estimates are 1.3 trillion per year by 2025 and 3.5 trillion per year by 2030. So clearly that's not the scale of what's flowing right now. What needs to change in the broader global financial architecture to ensure this sufficiency of scale, as well as quality of financing to meet the SDGs and climate action?
Thank you, Lily. So great to be in the same podium as you again. I'm here very much because Amitabh and Inam have set a task for themselves on which we collectively owe full throttle support, which is raising ambition in this year, but that extends beyond this year in delivering for both development and climate. And so I'm really privileged that, we are following not the previous panel, following in Avi's footsteps. So I really want to focus on the role of the G20 at this point in time to answer your question. So I think the G20 needs a strong and clear narrative that is owned by you, okay? And from my perspective, what's that narrative? It's that we are at a moment of grave risk, but also of great opportunity. We know that we are facing the most difficult crises that developing countries have faced in pretty much history, but we also know that there will be more crises to come along. So the world of crises are here to stay, and we need an architecture that will respond to it. Second, as we heard from Jeff, we are behind in virtually every SDG, and we are ill-prepared for the development challenges of the next 3 decades, including the demographic transition, where we will add 2 billion people to this planet, all in the developing world, other than China. And third, we are, of course, facing a climate crisis, whose impact is the greatest on the developing countries, but the developing countries other than China will account for more than 50% of emissions as soon as 2030. Therefore, they are the key to the solution. Acting on it is key to development. So what's the answer? It's an attractive path that Ani and others talked about, which is a better form of growth, different from the harmful, wasteful path of the past, and that is driven by two forces: innovation of the already here, innovation of the future, and investment. So I have done Jeff's bidding. I've done spreadsheets, as you said, for the past 2 years. I just want to put two numbers out there. The first number is, in order to meet the SDGs, in the large sense of the word, invest in all forms of capital that Jeff was talking about, we need to increase in investment in the SDGs from roughly about 2.4 trillion before the COVID crisis to about 5.8 trillion by 2030, a doubling. But within this space, we have to increase climate-related investments fourfold. What do I mean by climate-related investments? Investment in the energy transformation, investment in adaptation and resilience, financing of loss and damage, natural capital, and just transition. We are spending currently between 500 to 600 billion on this. We need to increase it fourfold in this decade. That is the area of the biggest increase that we need to invest in, but it's an opportunity. I'll come back to that. So last thing is, what does this imply then for the G20? So 4 areas of important action. First, we need an architecture for scaling up. All the finance in the world is academic unless we can turn, as Ani had said, ideas into programs, into investments. And we don't have that right now. In 2018, the G20 Eminent Persons Group recommended the proposal around country platforms. You have been associated with that too, Lily. We are not there. We have the just energy transition programs as an experimental state right now, but we don't need to do that just for energy. We need to do that for all priority objectives. So the G20 needs to think about an architecture for scaling up investments. Second, as we have heard repeatedly, the role of the multilateral development banks today are critical. Why? Because they are the instruments for scaling up. They can help translate those programs into viable investment in projects. They can bring the private sector to the table, as we heard, and their own finance is the best form of international public finance known in Mars, not just on Earth. So we have to be able to find a way to scale up the MDB system. That means not trying to say we're going to do the recommendations on the balance sheet first, private capital second, expanding capital. We need to press on the accelerator on all 3 here and now. That's the task for the G20. Second, we do need to create a new highway for private finance. What is absolutely clear is, in the green transition, the role of the private finance in the real sector is much greater than it was before. But just think about renewable energy. Think about, green hydrogen. Think about e-mobility. The private sector can play a very big role in this, but we need to bring private finance to the table. But we also need finance to be fit for purpose. It needs to be aligned with sustainability, and we need a new architecture around finance. I'm sure that Steve Weigel will talk more about that. And the last point I want to make on the agenda is about debt and concessional finance. So exactly as Avi was saying, we need to tackle the problems of overhang of debt, but we need to make sure that the cost of new debt is reasonable. We need to find smart ways to deal with contingent shocks, like of the kind that he mentioned. but we also will need to greatly expand the envelope of concessional finance. And if we are waiting for donors to come along and fill that gap, we'll be waiting a long time. So we need to get serious on options for concessional finance, including innovative ways. I'm very glad that President Macron is teaming up with Prime Minister Motley to push that agenda very strongly. I'm very glad that India has been invited as a co-chair of that initiative. So we really do need to expand concessional finance. So these 4 pillars, a practical way to scale up investments that is country-led, country-owned, country-specific. Second, scaling up of the MDB system so it's fit for purpose, a new highway for private finance, and dealing with debt and concessional finance. That is my agenda for the Indian G20 presidency. That doesn't end with the Indian G20 presidency, and all of you and all of us on this side have to really team up to get the results that Amitabh was talking about.
Let me turn next to you, George. You're the UNDP's chief economist, and we just heard a pretty compelling vision from fellow economist Jeff Sachs of what's needed, which I think underpins a lot of the so-called SDGs stimulus plan. So can you tell us a little bit more about what the stimulus plan entails? And I understand that there may be some elements of it that are actually feasible within the current global financial architecture, and then of course some elements of reform that are called for as well.
Thank you so much, Lily. I wanted to start by pointing out that what Avinash mentioned is things are achievable within the existing financial architecture, and we need to pinpoint them. We need to find them, we need to pursue them. And I want to talk briefly about that. But then we also have to look at what needs to be reformed. So because there are issues, and I think the Indian presidency with the concept of green development is positioning what needs to be reformed. Let me start with what we think is already within reach. The Secretary General has proposed an SDG stimulus plan. The building blocks of that plan are already on paragraph 7, 8, and 9 of the chair's summary in the finance track on liquidity, MDB reform, debt restructuring within the common framework. The technical case has been made. 52 economies are right now either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. That includes debt overhang for many low-income economies, but also many middle-income economies. Together, they're about 3% of global GDP, but account for 50% of global poverty today. That's the size of the problem. 25 of those economies are paying more than 20% of their government revenues on debt servicing this month. 20%. 17 of these economies are paying more than 10 percentage points in spread between treasury bills and their sovereign debt. That's 17 economies. So the technical case has been made. But has the political and development case been made? I think no. And I think that the Sherpa track needs to make that case. I think that the Indian presidency has positioned 2 ideas that can make that case. The first is that green development involves both having growth, jobs, human development on the one hand, but also energy transitions, deep decarbonization, green hydrogen on the other. Not one or the other, but both. The problem is that we need to craft the policy space and craft the international financial architecture to achieve that, because that's an empty quadrant today in the global policy space. What is it that can be achieved? What is the counterfactual to this absence of convergence? It's what we're seeing today. Divergence is the counterfactual. The default is geoeconomic fragmentation. The default is geopolitical fractures. So I think that's the first political message that I think needs to be interiorized. The second has to do with how we move forward with reforms of the international financial architecture. And again, the green development concept provides us a way forward. Many of the first movers, the European Union with its Green New Deal and a focus on industrial policy, the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act and its focus on subsidies and tax credits, the Chinese low carbon, green economy and circular economy positioning. These 3 first movers are already telling us something about what green development can look like. but it's not telling the full story for developing economies, because what's missing there is all of sub-Sahara Africa. What's missing is all of the small island developing states. What's missing are all of the fossil fuel dependent economies that need to transition from coal and from hydrocarbons and fossil fuels to renewable resources. That together is about 170 economies in the world. That is 70% actually of GDP, and it includes countries like India that are actually first movers, but also in a category of high climate vulnerability, and also in a category of leading on energy transitions and thinking about green hydrogen. So we have a very unique constellation of a moment to rethink the international financial architecture from the point of view of developing economies. I'll leave it there. This is the year of summits. We've got the G20, of course. We've got the Macron summit. We have the SDG summit at the UN, and we have the summit of the future in the next 12 months. We believe that there's a lot of pressure right now to rethink where we're going, to think what is that Bretton Woods 2.0 moment. And I think to do that, we need to look at the future. We have to start thinking not only about GDP or GDP per capita, but start to think about well-being and sustainability beyond GDP. So that will include, from our point of view, the highest level of human development within planetary boundaries. Those metrics need to guide the way we move forward and not be caught in sort of the past discourse or relitigating the discussion that we had in 2008 or 2009. Thank you.
Thanks so much, George. I note many commonalities between the SDG stimulus plan and the Bridgetown agenda, which is no coincidence, since about a year or so ago at a pretty pivotal retreat, the UN was standing shoulder to shoulder with the government of Barbados, a number of other governments and civil society to sort of co-develop this agenda and really make that stronger call. And I'm glad that that's brought us here today, some of that work. All right, let's now turn to you, Nina. You are head of the South Asia region for the European Investment Bank. And let me know if I've got this right. A full 90% of your lending portfolio to India is focused on climate action. Is that right?
That's absolutely right, yes.
All right. Well, so you've definitely identified this as a singular priority for your bank then. So what kind of capital and what kind of access to capital does a country like India need for climate and SDG action? And what is the role that MDB should be playing to provide and channel that capital?
Yep, thank you very much. And may I start by saying I'm really honored to be here today on this amazing panel representing EIB. We're the Bank of the European Union. And as you said, we really exist to support EU policy objectives inside and also 10% of our activity outside, including here in India. And we've really put climate, pollution, and biodiversity emergencies at the top of that agenda. And we were the first MDB to be fully Paris-aligned because we don't want to be doing any harm, but we've also committed to doing at least 50% of our activity fully on climate and environment by 2025, and we've done that early. And here in India, as I said, you know, we've done 90% already. But we're not doing enough, right? And you know, we've heard today that there is so much more to be done. Even in the EU, we carry out an annual investment survey. And we've seen there, my colleagues have been telling me that the pandemic hit investment badly, it hit investment in climate, and it hasn't recovered. We're falling far short of what we need to do. And worryingly, investment in innovation even is still falling. And that's in the EU, that's in Germany. And then we start to think about developing countries, and even India as an emerging economy. We saw the graph that Professor Sachs showed, right? You know, you're facing these huge spreads, and how can we expect these countries to be making these investments, which are really crucial for the future of the world, right? Not just for India. And in their interests, right? These are productive investments. How can we expect these countries to be doing that? How can we support them? And what do we need the G20 Sherpas and others to be pushing for? So I have a few ideas that I wanted to put forward. So first, I think is, you know, really to focus, agree on the goals, but agree also on the urgency of these goals. You know, the world is in a very scary place this year. But that doesn't mean we can take a pause, because actually the climate emergency really should be at the top of all our minds, and we shouldn't allow us to be distracted from that. And you know, that's why we've been taking these steps at the EIB, and that's also why, you know, a lot of the words that people were saying today about climate and development, Climate is development. There is no development without thinking about the climate crisis, without thinking about resilience, without thinking about adaptation. And these are things we're trying to take very seriously at EIB. We set ourselves targets for doing more on adaptation because, we're bankers and we also look at these spreadsheets and we don't do anything unless there's a kind of percentage there. But we all need to do more on that, and I think that's something that the G20 Sherpas can play an important role in pushing us towards that. And this is not easy, We're very proud of what we've achieved in becoming Paris aligned, but that was not an easy discussion, particularly during an energy crisis, to say that we're not going to fund any more new gas projects. That was not an easy discussion, but we took that decision because this is something that matters for all of us, and we're happy to see our peers also moving in the same direction with us. But of course, it's not enough. We all need to do more, whether it's 5 times more, 10 times more, whether we're going to do that through SDRs or the callable capital. We're involved in a lot of those debates, and we are there and willing to cooperate. But I wanted to make the point that it's not just about doing more, it's about doing differently. It's about taking calculated risks to get that capital going, to get the projects going in the countries where they need to happen. So yes, India needs capital. Right? And where we invest in long maturity projects. So we provide tenors of 20, 25 years to make these productive investments that are really focused on climate. And we bring our technical expertise to make sure that this is done in an environmentally and also socially sustainable way. So I believe that has a very important impact. But we need to be doing more also in lower income economies, right? And this is possible. This is something that we can do. And I always think about the example, we do 90% of our business inside the EU. And when we were hit in the EU by the global financial crisis, the European Commission and the European Investment Bank worked together to create, they called it the European Fund for Strategic Investment. And there, we did more. We were able to have this kind of ramping up of investment, and we were able to push towards riskier segments so that we could support smaller firms, so that we could support innovation. And actually, it's really touching. We found out afterwards, one of the programs we started there was a venture debt program. And one of the firms we supported under that was called BioNTech. We don't want to take a credit for what BioNTech did in the pandemic because our funding actually came a bit later. But I think it shows that these kind of decisions, which were really taken by our shareholders, who are the people who are sat in the G20 meetings, to push us to take those kind of risks, because there are these market gaps and the capital is not getting where it needs to go, this has an impact. So I think there's a lot that can be achieved. Of course, lending capacity on its own is not going to take us there. And we're also going to need to do more to get those bankable projects so that it can be absorbed. And this is not just about saying, okay, it's the emerging economies that haven't done their homework, they don't have the projects. This is homework for us to work with them to develop those projects. And that's what we did inside the EU, right? So when we set up this FC fund, we set up technical advisory, we set up, we invested our own people in our own human resources so that we could be there to create these pipelines of projects so that we can then deploy that capital. And this is something that I hope the G20 will also be thinking about. Not that, it's some kind of magic panacea, we pull in this callable capital and everything's going to fall into place, because that's not the case. And then finally, a thing, and I think this is very relevant actually for India, is discussions around common language. And sometimes these seem like very dry and dull discussions, about taxonomy and standards. But these are really, really super important for bringing in private capital, as well as bringing in partners like the multilaterals. And that's something that EIB, we were the first, we're very proud to have been the first to launch green bonds back in 2007. And we've worked very closely with other partners on the kind of standards for those, so that it's something that investors can trust, that we don't have this problem with greenwashing. There's still more to do. We're still working on making sure that adaptation is properly taken care of so that investors can come into that, but also other SDGs. So, it's not just about climate. We've been talking about that today, and we need to have similar kind of standards so that people can invest in gender, so that people can invest in education. I'm going to stop there. There's so much more I could and would love to say, but I want to give space to the others. But I really look to the G20 to give us this kind of push on many of these areas I've been talking about. And I think listening to Sri Amitabh Kant today. I think India wants to give that push, and I'm a born optimist. I hope that a lot will come out of this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nina. I think when I hear all this talk of MDB reform and Bretton Woods 2.0, there's a lot of connotation that it's these institutions that are to blame. They're not doing enough. They're too old-fashioned and bureaucratic and not fit for purpose for modern crises. But I think as people like Nina demonstrate, there's a lot of institutional knowledge and appetite for doing a whole lot more in these institutions by the people who actually are on the front lines of development and climate finance and perhaps understand the urgency of these problems more so than many others. And actually, it's not just about reforming the institutions themselves, but also the political will from their shareholders, their governance structure, from political bodies like the G20 that can sort of give that needed push, also give the sufficiency of scale of financing through these institutions that we've talked about so much here. So, with that, let's move on to you, Steve. You're Chief Responsible Investment Officer of the global insurance firm Aviva. You helped to bring a sort of private sector perspective into this conversation. So from your vantage point, what are the systemic changes that are needed to sort of unleash financial markets for these forces for green development? And what does that approach look like to you? And also, how optimistic are you that we might be able to get there in the time frame that we need?
Wow. That's a multi-layered question, Lee. Thank you. And I should start by saying what a huge privilege it is to be here. I'm really honored to be sharing this panel with such an august set of leaders in this space, and really honored to have had the invitation. Thank you very much indeed. In terms of my hope, you talked about optimism there. I've worked in this area for about 25 years, and when I say this area, I mean how do you harness private finance to deliver a just and smooth transition? That's roughly what I've been looking at for the last 25 years. And I've never had more hope, actually, than I have today. And I know that's odd, given we've just had the IPCC's summary of their sixth assessment. But the reason why I say that is because conversations like this are taking place, which just didn't exist even 3 years ago, and certainly not 25 years ago when I started. There are more finance ministers now talking about this, more central bank governors. And it's they that need to harness markets. So the fact that they're recognizing the concern is the single biggest fact that gives me hope. Now, probably the most important fact I can share with you, and then I'm going to give 3 recommendations. But the most important fact is you may have been lulled into a sense of security, actually. You've heard about 1.1 degrees, 1.5 degrees. Obviously, you'll be aware that Paris takes us no further than north of 2. But the honest, blunt, stark reality is the current structure of markets are rewarding 3.5 degrees. That is what we're capitalizing. If you look at the implied temperature change of most developed countries, the proven and probable reserves of the fossil fuel sector take us to north of 3 degrees. And it pays those companies to extract at that rate because of that fact. So in other words, the Paris Agreement is a political ambition. It is not a reality in the markets today. Far, far from it. North of 3 degrees, as you all know, sees hundreds of millions of people, if not billions of people, migrating by the end of the century. That is the blunt, stark reality which the gentleman from WRI was so clear about. Absolutely true. So the private sector is beginning to wake up to that. Private finance, particularly, but only just beginning to wake up to that. The consequences to the insurance business model, if we get to 3.5 degrees, are existential crisis. There will be huge amounts of the global economy that we won't want to underwrite. That remains, some of that remains, the customer will not be able to afford the premium. For those of you lucky enough to have a mortgage, could you afford the premium in your home insurance if it was 3 or 4% of your house price? Most people couldn't. So in other words, most developed markets that lend through mortgages will be in technical default because their insurance won't be affordable. We saw what 8% of the US mortgage market going subprime did just over 10 years ago now. We're talking about every mortgage market everywhere going subprime in a big way. That's an unrecoverable end of century situation. And the G20 is the organization that can demonstrate leadership now. I'm going to take you through 3 slides. It's a crash course MBA in about 2 minutes, so forgive me, please. But for those of you that have been looking at the slide, it's a schematic representing how money flows through the system from the end investor, the people who've worked hard to save, how it then goes through from the left, through pensions, through their institutional pension, maybe through their insurance company, how their insurance companies then use investment consultants, and there are only really 12 investment consultants in the world that really matter. Those consultants choose fund managers, and 25 of the world's fund managers run more than half of the world's assets under management. So huge concentration here. Those asset managers then buy and sell on stock exchange, and only about 15 exchanges represent 90% of capital, which is a problem that Jeff was referring to. But those stock exchanges used to be government regulators. They were owned by government. Most of them have become for-profit and listed on their own exchange and incentivized their executives to focus on total shareholder return and earnings per share, which has made them machines for short-termism. These used to be institutional regulators. They're no longer that, they're profit centers. That is an enormous problem. Then you have the investment banks that bring the capital to the companies that need it. And the business model of investment banks is also one based on churn. The more they buy and sell companies for the fund manager, the more money they make. That's true of a stock exchange too. So nobody designed the system, but the incentives within it, the pay structure, the business models, they're all aligned with short-termism, not the end of the century. That's why it's being discounted. An existential crisis of 3.5 degrees is being discounted to being meaningless now. Now, one of the changes that we need to make here is the cost of capital does not reflect the cost of carbon. The best way of doing that is, of course, by internalizing the externality. It can be done in a range of ways, not just carbon pricing, not just emissions trading, but standards and regulation. The OECD offered this forum a year ago the opportunity to provide advice to emerging markets and developing countries on how to implement a cost of carbon that was fit for their NDC. I don't know why that offer from the OECD wasn't taken up. That for me was a substantive recommendation, and I'd like to see it. There's something the Sherpa track can show leadership on. The OECD should become a bridge from rich country capital to poor country need. So there's a substantive recommendation for you. Second, at the moment, I sit on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which the Financial Stability Board run. All of that applies to corporate disclosure, corporate bonds, corporate equities. And TCFD guidance is, I think, spectacularly now being embedded in the system, but it says nothing about sovereign disclosure. It says nothing about supranational agency disclosure, and transition and physical risk applies there too. The G20 Sherpa track could ask the TCFD to now produce guidance for sovereigns, sub-sovereigns, and supranational agencies, voluntary guidance. And the reason for doing that is so that the countries can maintain their cost of capital, because otherwise they will receive a downgrade if they've got extreme physical risk. And most emerging markets and developing economies have more physical risk than developed. That's a further tragedy. So that's how the money flows. And on the next slide, actually I have this, don't I? On the next slide, you've heard the phrase, the international financial architecture, many, many times. It is supposed to be the way banking, insurance, and investment is governed. At the heart of that little Venn diagram in the middle is the real economy. Every company has a bank, is banked, they have a bank account. Most companies in the market have insurance. Some of them come to the market for investment. Those are the three pillars of finance. They're governed in a way to keep them separate. They're regulated at the national level. The standards are drawn internationally. There are forums, associations of regulators internationally that are all appointed and mandated by the multilateral process, including you. That financial architecture was never designed to deal with green development. It was never designed to deal with the climate crisis. It needs to be rethought. It needs to be re-engineered nearly on the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Agreement. And I think a substantive recommendation is that the India track could commission the Sustainable Finance Working Group, one of your working groups, to work with the International Financial Architecture Working Group to bring a stock take to the UAE COP28 of that financial architecture, facilitate a conversation about how it can be enhanced, and bring substantive recommendations to the Brazilian G20 next year about how to repurpose and rethink the financial architecture so that it is on a net zero footing. And that, in association with the Bridgetown agenda, ladies and gentlemen, has a chance of getting you the 4 to 6 trillion that is needed a year, which itself is 16 times what it took to land a man on the moon and rebuild the global economy after the Second World War in present prices every year. It's an enormous amount of money. Where is the plan? Where is the organization that owns the plan? It is astonishing fact. We had the Apollo program and the Marshall Plan. Where's the equivalent to raise 4 to 6 trillion a year? Thank you very much indeed for the time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve. I mean, as I'm fearlessly taking notes here, I definitely recognize a lot of commonalities and synchronicities between all of these agendas. I hear liquidity. I hear debt relief and reform. I hear a call for scale in many different ways. A call for looking at the MDBs and other IFIs and institutions and what they can be do to channel finance. And I think overall, what I also hear is that actually we have a lot of technical solutions already. I mean, you're talking to some of the leading technical experts who have been in the markets, in these institutions, on the front lines of development and climate for decades now, collectively. And it's clear what the technical solutions are, but it's about now political will. And it does seem like, optimistically, that we have a near-term political window before us in the next 9 to 12 months, perhaps more, with all of these key moments coming up. We have the spring meetings shortly in DC, we have the Modi-Macron summit in June, we have the G20 summit, then the annual meetings, the SDG summit for this year's UNGA. We have COP, we have potentially some kind of Bretton Woods 80 moment next year, right? I mean, this is perhaps an unprecedented period in the history of sort of development finance, of political attention on some of this reform agenda. So let's not waste this window of opportunity, I suppose, is the one final call from me, hopefully on behalf of all the panelists here. So thank you so much for listening to some of these recommendations and for reflecting on them. Now, we do have some time left, so I can open it up to the audience for some questions.
Thank you very much, Sean Bisharp, UN Resident Coordinator. And first of all, let me just say it's a real honor for us to work with the G20 Presidency of India, Sherpa Track, and ORF on helping to make these panels possible. But I just thought maybe to ask a question to whoever might like to answer, looking at a slightly different approach to galvanizing incentives. And that is the recent discussion in the General Assembly about an advisory position to the International Court of Justice on the obligations of states in respect of climate change. So the legal obligation. Just wondering if any of the panelists have any thoughts on that direction. Thank you.
Avi, go ahead.
So I think that it's, we need a broad front of approaches, and I think that is useful. But I think we've got to recognize that countries are coming from different places, and countries have different abilities. So for example, in countries where it is easy to move from sector to sector because the cost of capital is low, liquidity is plentiful, the economy is broad and deep, then it makes sense to use penalties and taxes to encourage it to move away from certain things. But for many developing countries where doing business is just hard, full stop, where the cost of capital is high, using penalties and taxes actually leads to a development cost rather than the same kind of adjustment. So I think we need different approaches. We need to support the transition in developing countries by making the cost of capital cheaper and helping to finance that. And we need to send very clear price signals and legal issues, legal signals in rich countries where the choices for development are much broader.
Just to add, so at the national level, it helps to have national commitment. And if you look at the UK, for example, the way in which climate change has been incorporated into law really helps. But to take that to the international level, I think is problematic for the reasons that Avi mentioned. I've personally been very involved in the 100 billion story. I co-led the Secretary General's expert group on the 100 billion. And I think, the lesson from that is, that conversation and that process has not been very productive. It has led to more acrimony than, action. So I think we have to pursue, as Avi said, all approaches. Yes, hold donors and countries to account, but also take the options that really produce results, which means volume, the kind of tenor that Jeff Sachs was talking about, and for developing countries, very crucially, the cost of capital. So we really need to pursue an all-of-the-above approach, but I don't think we will get a solution if we go international law on this. We have to actually work at it with a spirit of collaboration, cooperation, and possibilities.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this very insightful panel. My name is Trudy Makaya. I'm the Sherpa from South Africa. So 2 questions for the panel. I think it was mentioned by Mr. Bhattacharya in passing, the platforms, the just energy transition plans that some of our countries have embarked on, South Africa, Vietnam, Indonesia, I believe, and a few others. Of course, we all have our thoughts, but I'd be curious to hear from you, as experts, your observations on the lessons that we're learning as we go along and how we can smooth that path, even as we experiment with those kinds of platforms. Because I think there's enough that has happened so far to show where some of the weaknesses might be and how we can build on the strengths of those partnerships. And then secondly, another issue which was raised in passing was around debt climate swaps, including in the previous panel. I think Ms. Bohuluk and Wendo mentioned the possibility of debt climate. And that seems to be a very difficult agenda that a lot of people don't want to talk about. Countries are afraid if they introduce that in the mix, they would be penalized and seen to be defaulting and not actually doing proper debt climate swaps, especially middle-income countries. I know they've been done for a few small island states, but not so much for other middle-income countries. So I'd also love to hear what you think the agenda is to further the application and the acceptability of those kinds of instruments. Thank you.
Yep, Avi, go ahead.
Okay, so we've just, in Barbados, done a debt for climate swap, won the Sustainability Award for bonds. But what we've learned from that experience, and we've learned from that, green bonds, blue bonds, voluntary carbon credits, is they're all great, add them to the mix, they don't mobilize a lot of resources. They do not move the needle today. Maybe one day they will. But if we start to rely upon it to change, it's not going to work. We released $50 million over 12 years. That's great. $50 million more than we had, but that's not going to change anything. The Just Energy Transition Partnerships, I think, have been really interesting. I initially was against them. I felt it underscored the conceit that rich countries felt all that mattered was that poor countries should have a plan. And I think what they've shown is that it was a conceit. There is a great plan now, but it's not being financed. But the planning process was great. We have a better sense of what it needs and costs for South Africa to make that transition. What we need is proper financing. And that's why we're proposing a just green transition financing trust that lowers the cost of capital in South Africa from over 12% down to the 4 or 5% mark that will drive the private sector to finance that transition, because otherwise they will not come.
Amar, would you like to address the question on JETPs?
Yeah, I'll address the question of JETP, and then I have to take care of my own just transition. I have a plane to catch. So I wanted to say that I've been privileged actually to be quite involved in the front lines of the South Africa JETP, and I've also been quite involved in the Indonesia JETP. So let me begin by saying it's a very difficult task. It's a very difficult task at the country level to bring together all partners. South Africa, through the Presidential Commission, has done an incredible job, but it has been difficult, and the task still remains. It is also not a plan for 1 year, it's a plan for many years. In my view, the South Africa JETP requires financing of 250 to 300 billion spread over 12 to 15 years. What do we have in terms of finance right now? 8.5 billion on the table. A very small fraction of that is concessional. And we don't really know what the financing will look like next year, let alone for the 15 years. So yes, indeed, putting together a financing plan is very valuable. We are also beginning to learn that there are going to be potentials for innovation. The Indonesia JETP, for example, is making a link between the just transition and potential for a voluntary carbon market transaction, with Secretary Kerry leading in some sense some aspects there. So one thing that I will say is these are very valuable instruments for experimentation, innovation, and commitment. So we shouldn't give up on them. I would like to see a just transition for adaptation. I would like to see a just transition for nature. So we shouldn't just stop with the energy transition. This is something where scaling up, as was mentioned by many panelists before, really needs to be taken to all priority objectives. And with that, if I may be excused, Lily, thank you.
Nina, why don't I turn to you next for some of these thoughts?
Thank you. I just wanted to respond on the just energy transition because I know EIB has been quite involved in South Africa. And I think I agree with some of the other participants, notably Bogdano was saying, I don't know that transition is the right term, and I don't know that the debate has been framed in necessarily the best way. But I think that it has become something that's a very useful tool for us as a financier. Because actually what we want to do, what I think our job is as a financier, is to give an offer. So, under the EU's Global Gateway Initiative, we want to be there and we want to say, this just energy transition plan that you have, that you want to do, this is something that's also helping us, and therefore, this is what we can offer to support that. And that needs to be a good package. It needs to be a package that combines the technical as well as the financial. Also, technology needs to be in there. And I think it's something, by having those needs laid out there, it can push us to make that offer better, right? To make it something attractive that our clients actually are going to want to take up. So I think, it's something that we can build on. And yeah, I think it can also be, this kind of thinking can be extended to other sectors and other needs.
Maybe on the question of debt, I think I agree with Avi. When we think about the debt for nature experiences, the swap experiences, they're usually localized and small scale. But there is a scenario in which this could be scalable. And as we look at the common framework and some of the limitations of what's going on and how to bring in private creditors and how to bring in non-traditional creditors and how to broker a deal, many of missing instruments include the potential for a debt swap, whether it's a Brady Bond 2.0 type of swap that would ensure that private creditors get 70 cents on the dollar, say, when they're trading at 50 cents on the dollar right now, so they would make a profit, if you will. But what would make a Brady Bond palatable for the G7 or for non-traditional donors, including China? Perhaps the link to climate, if they could count the emissions for those G7 plus China countries. So that's the kind of conversation which could lead to a different type of deal, a deal for 30, for 40, for 50 countries. And that's actually coming up in a couple of papers from the UN, but also from the IFIs in the next few weeks. Thank you.
Excellent. And with that, I think we're at time. So thank you again to all the speakers and panelists, and thank you all.
Thank you to everyone. Well, I think it's very hard to find words to summarize what we have discussed today, the amazing discussions that we had. So I think I would just not attempt at summarizing, but just thank very much our panelists for their passion, for their work. I think it's been really, really amazing. On behalf of Sherpa, thank you everyone for being here with us today. Colleagues, we did hear that the challenges that developing countries are facing are indeed unprecedented. If you were to think of any time in history where a country did poverty alleviation, dealt with climate risks, global uncertainties, dealt with transitions, which creates its own chaos, and became a developed nation, well, that has never happened in the history of the world. So we are indeed embarking on a path where developing countries are to do all of these things at the same time. So the challenge, the task is enormous, so has to be our ambition, and that's why we have, as a president of the G20, chosen ambitious priorities. Now, on the question of how to do it, I think some of our speakers have said, so I will just take from their words, we have to tread the space in between the binaries. The binaries between climate and development, growth and sustainability, several binaries that we heard today. Between agreement and disagreement, that's something that we also are in the middle of in the world as we speak. So I think it's very important to also understand that the panelists also spoke about it from the examples of Indian mythological examples and stories. Well, for those who know India and who know Indians, they know that historically and mythologically, we are very comfortable and familiar in treading the space between binaries. So on that path, as we go with our G20 partners, we aim to find consensus exactly in those spaces, the in-between spaces. Usually I would say, let's put our pen to paper, but as Jeff has said, let's get back to the Excel sheet. So thank you very much, and thanks for being here today.